Welcome back. Now that we have some experience with the Pi and how to play in Editor, as well as how to move around and manipulate our position in our level, it's time to learn how to manipulate objects in our level. And this is pivotal to level design because often in our levels, in the Unreal Engine viewport, we're often going to be placing objects and moving them around as we see fit. Now, we've already seen that if we click on something in our world, such as the floor, that we get this little gizmo here. Now, if you didn't get that, it's because you're not in this mode, Select and Translate Objects. So these four icons here determine what we can do when we select an object. If you didn't get that little gizmo, you may be in Select Objects mode, which is the leftmost icon. And this is the most basic form of selection. You can click on an object and you'll see it highlight in the outliner, so you'll know what the name of that object is, but you don't have the gizmo for moving it around. To get that gizmo, you click on the next icon that says Select and Translate Objects. With that selected, and now that you have the gizmo, you can click on the arrows on the gizmo, and those allow you to move the object. We have three arrows because in 3D or 3 dimensions, we have 3 directions. In the engine, these are named X, Y, and Z. The red arrow pointing off into the distance is pointing in the X direction. And I can grab that red arrow and I can click and drag and move that floor back and forth in the X direction. I can click on the green arrow and move in the Y direction, and I can click on the blue arrow and move up and down in the Z direction. And after you've moved something, you can undo that movement with Control Z. I'm going to do that 3 times to bring it back to where it was before. Of course, edit and undo is the same as Control Z. That's your universal undo operation. So moving objects around is as simple as clicking and dragging on the arrows of the gizmo. And notice the gizmo has these little squares that connect any given pair of arrows. You can hover over that little square and notice both arrows are highlighted. And that means you can move around in that plane. If I'm highlighting both the X and Y arrows and I click and drag, I'm now moving around in both the X and the Y directions, but my Z direction is not changing. We're not moving up and down, only moving around in the XY plane. And you can do this with each pair of axes. I can hover over the square that connects the Z and X directions, and I'm moving around in the XZ plane, but we're not changing our Y position. Now, this position has a numerical value. We call these coordinates. And with the floor selected, I can come over to the Details panel to see context-sensitive information about the thing that I have selected, including the location. Under Transform, we have a location property, which has 3 components, X, Y, and Z, and they're even color-coded to make it easy for you to know which dimension we're thinking about. If I click and drag on the red arrow for the floor, notice that the X value of the location property is changing as I change it, as I move the floor. Same goes for the Y, and same goes for the Z. So the location is a property that we can change with the gizmo, but we can also change it here in the Details panel. Let's say I want this floor to have a location of 0 for its X component. I can enter a 0, hit enter, and it'll snap the floor over to 0 in the X direction. I can also zero out the Y, and I can zero out the Z. This means that the floor has a location of 0, 0, 0. We often refer to this location as the origin of our level. The origin is always an X, Y, and Z of 0. So that's how we move objects around. We can set their location to a specific value, or we can hand place the location with our mouse. Now, the icon that allows us to select to translate objects has a hotkey shortcut of W, And if we want to go back to just selecting objects without being able to move them around, that hotkey is Q. So we can use W and Q on our keyboard to switch between those modes. We also have the ability to rotate objects. That's the very next icon. It says select and rotate objects, and that has a hotkey of E. Now notice the gizmo changes. We now have colored rounded arcs here. And these colors are indicative of the axis about which we are rotating the object. So if I hit W and go back to translation mode, I can see that the object has an X direction pointing here to the right on my screen. And if I hit E to go into rotation mode, notice that the circular arc indicates that we can rotate about the X axis, about that red arrow. And I can click and I can rotate. Now notice we're rotating by increments of 10 degrees. That's because we have snapping enabled for rotation. Snapping allows us to move or rotate an object in set increments. And in fact, if we go up to this icon here, there's a little angle icon that says enables or disables snapping objects to a rotation grid. If I click that, it's no longer blue, it's no longer enabled, and now I can click and drag and rotate this platform smoothly. I'm not snapping by 10-degree increments. And we can even control how many degrees we snap by. If I enable snapping again and click on this 10 degrees next to it, I can change it. I can rotate by 30-degree increments. And now if I rotate, I'm rotating by a much larger snapping amount. Snapping works for moving objects as well. In fact, we see that this icon that says enables or disables snapping to the grid when dragging objects around, that's already blue. We've already had snapping enabled. We've just been moving by such a small grid snap value that it isn't really noticeable that we're snapping. If I change this from 10 to 100, and now I hit W to get my translation gizmo, I can click and drag, and I can see that we're snapping by increments of 100. Snapping allows us to place objects in a more precise manner. Now we can also scale objects, make them larger or smaller. That's the fourth icon up here that says select and scale objects. If I select that, the gizmo changes once again. And we have 3 axes. They're no longer arrows, but they have boxes at the end. And I can scale in each respective dimension. I can scale this thing down in the X direction. I can scale it down in the Y direction. And now I have a very small platform. And of course, I can scale in the Z direction as well and bring this up to a very small, thin platform. And notice every time we change the location, rotation, or the scale, those values are changing over in the details panel. And we can even set them manually. I can set the scale to, let's say, 2 in the X. And now we have a scale of 2. The original mesh that was the floor now has a scale of 2 times its original X dimension. Now, if you want to quickly set all 3 of the values of one of these properties in the transform to the same value, you can enter a number, and while we still have the blinking cursor, we can hit the tab key and we'll jump on over to the next component of that property. Now I'm on the Y component of the scale. I can hit a 1, I can hit tab, and now I'm in the Z. I can hit, let's say, 2, and now we've scaled up that platform by 2 in the Z direction. Now each of these properties has a default value, the value that it starts off at, and the little curved arrow to the right says reset this property to its default value. If I click on that, it's going to go back to what it was initially before I messed with it. I can do that for the rotation. I can do that for the location. So every time we change a property of the object we have selected, we get that arrow. It now pops up because we've changed it, and we now have the option to reset it back to its default setting. Now, you might feel that the hotkeys don't make much sense. Translating objects, why isn't it T to translate or M to move? Well, these are representative of the keys on the keyboard, and they're in order. Select objects is the Q key. Translate objects is the next key over to the right on your keyboard. That's W. And rotate is the next key over, that's E, and scale is the next key over, that's R. So the keys on the keyboard are ordered in the same order as the icons here, and that can be an easy way to remember. You can always get back to your regular select objects mode with Q, and then jump to one of these object manipulation modes with W, E, and R. And I always use the hotkeys. I rarely come up and click on them. Sometimes I do, but I almost always just hit W to get that translation gizmo and E to get that rotation gizmo. Now, I've gone and set the snapping increments. I'm going to set them back to what they were. For translation, I'll go back to a snap size of 10. And for rotation, I'll go back to a snap size of 10. And that way, we're back to the defaults. And of course, now that I've changed the transform properties for this mesh, I'm going to go back to the details panel and I'm going to hit that curved arrow to reset back to defaults. Now, the platform looks smaller than it was before, and that must mean that it was scaled up larger than its default size in the first place. But that's not a big deal. If we want to make this platform larger, we know how. We can go to scale mode, hitting the R key, and we can scale it up. Let's say I want to scale it in both the X and Y directions. I can just bring it up to the size I want, and if I want an exact amount, I can just go down to the details panel, and I can change its scale to, let's say, 4 for the X and the Y. Notice there's a lock icon here. The pop-up says, when locked, scales uniformly based on the current X, Y, Z scale values, so the object maintains its shape in each direction when scaled. So if I click that lock icon and lock these components down, now I can enter a 3 in the X, hit enter. Notice the Z went down to 0.75. Well, that's because X and Y were at 4, and when I changed it to 3, well, that's 3/4 of what it was before. So it's going to scale down the Z component by 3/4. It was at 1, now it's at 0.75. If that seems a little bit confusing, let's enter a 4 and hit enter and see again that we have an X of 4 for the scale, a Y of 4, and a Z of 1. Now, because I have this lock icon locked down, whatever I change for one of the properties, it's going to change the others proportionately. If I change the X from 4 to 2, I'm cutting that 4 in half to 2, so it's going to cut the Y in half to 2 and the Z in half to 0.5. So if I hit enter, now we see 0.5. So that's how that lock icon works. I'm going to unlock it, and I'm going to click the curved arrow, and now we're back to a scale of 1, the default value for scale. So that's how we manipulate objects around, translate, rotate, and scale them. And location, rotation, and scale are all properties of the transform for the object. So when you see the word transform, that encompasses location, rotation, and scale. Now, all we have in our level is this platform. Yes, there are other objects, but we haven't really discussed what they are yet. But we can select them, and we can manipulate them with translation, rotation, and scale. If I hit W, I can move these objects around. I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that. But we also know that the outliner tells us what it is that we have selected. The very topmost object here, at least on this Unreal Engine version, once selected, we see in the outliner that it's the volumetric cloud. Now, let's right-click and drag up to look at the sky. And let's hide that volumetric cloud by closing the eye icon. Notice the clouds go away. So that right there tells us that the volumetric cloud results in us seeing these moving clouds in the sky. And that's what this object here is. If we were to delete that, well, the clouds would go away. And notice if I move it back and forth, the clouds don't move. That's because it doesn't really matter where in the world this volumetric cloud object is. Those clouds are independent of this object's location. We could move it out of the way if we don't like seeing it there. And as we're designing our levels, these might get in the way and we can move them out of the way. And the same goes for these other objects here. These are all related to lighting. As we can see, they're in the lighting folder in the outliner. And we can close and open the eye icon to see what they are and what they change. The sky atmosphere makes our world black when we hide it. Now, we're not going to dive too deeply into lighting and atmosphere in this video, but if you like, you can select all of them. You can hold Shift and click on objects to select multiple objects at the same time. And if you want to move these out of the way so they're not distracting you, you can bring them up with the blue arrow and bring them up out of the way. Now, if you want to move the camera along with you as you're moving things, you can click on the gizmo and hold Shift. And as I drag my mouse up, my camera is moving up along with those objects. And I can just bring them up and out of the way. Now, what's this last object here? It looks like a controller. Well, notice if we start a Pi session by clicking play, we always start here in the center. I can click stop, and I can move myself way out here away from that controller, and I can press play, and I snap back to the middle. We always start playing the game right here at the location of this. And if we select it, we see in the outliner, it's called player start. So we, as the player, will always start at the location of the player start. I can move it off to the side here on the edge of the platform, and if I press play, I'm on the edge of the platform. So a player start is a really nice way to designate where we're supposed to start in the game. So we're going to leave that one right there in the middle, so we can always start the game right there in the middle when we start a Pi session. So now that we know a little bit more about those objects in our world, and we've moved those objects up there and out of the way, we're better equipped to design our levels. Now, oftentimes when we design our levels, we like to prototype the levels by blocking out geometry. We may know that right here there's going to be a rock or a tree, but maybe we don't have that rock or tree just yet. Oftentimes, level designers will place a simple piece of geometry like a rectangular block right there to block out the level or prototype the level. Now, if you did the last challenge and added a content pack to your project, then you're going to have a level prototyping folder. This came with that content pack that we added. If you click on that, inside of it, we have 3 folders: materials, meshes, and textures. Now, the platform that we've been scaling up and rotating and moving around, this is a mesh. A mesh has 3-dimensional information. It looks like a solid object. And the level prototyping tools contain a number of meshes. Let's go into that meshes folder. And we have a few tools to work with. These are meshes. More specifically, we refer to these as static meshes, as they're not capable of morphing or animating themselves. And we'll learn more about what static meshes are later. But these are static meshes, and we can drag them into our world. Notice there's a static mesh cube. If I drag that in, I can just click and drag into the viewport. And before I release my mouse button, notice that I'm placing this cube somewhere, and it's kind of snapping to the floor like that. And if I release, now we have a static mesh cube. It's even in the outliner. We see it right here. And the same object manipulation tools can apply to this new object. We can move it around. We can rotate it. If I press the E key, I can rotate. I do have snapping, so I'm snapping by 10-degree increments. We can scale it on up. But notice if I scale in the X direction, well, look at this little grid material that's on this cube. As we're scaling up, we have these nice incremental lines, and this allows us to prototype that shape. It's really easy to prototype a level with tools like this. If I want to scale it up by exactly this amount, the same height that it was before, well, those little grid lines allow us to do that easily. So I can block my level out by placing some geometry using those tools. And there are a few other tools. We have a cylinder. Let's drag one of those in, and I can move it around. I can rotate it. I can scale it. And now I have this cylinder platform here. And this quarter cylinder, let's drag one of those in. This is kind of a corner. We have a nice rounded corner, and we can use this to round off those corners on objects. Let's get another static mesh cube in here and put it right next to it. And now this nice corner can be placed right there at the edge, and it looks like it's rounded. Now, I could bring my content drawer up and bring in another quarter cylinder, and I can rotate it by 90 degrees, and I can move it into place here so that I have 2 rounded corners, right? But there's a quicker way to prototype this way. We can duplicate objects. I'm going to go ahead and take this new rounded corner. I'm going to hit the delete key to delete it. And I'd like to duplicate this object, this rounded corner. To duplicate an object, there are a couple ways. You can always Control-C to copy and Control-V to duplicate. Notice we have a new quarter cylinder in our outliner, and that's the one that's selected. It's at the same exact location as the old one, but if I move it, now I see that there's two. So Control-C, Control-V could be dangerous if you forget that you've duplicated something and they're both in the same exact location. You may have two meshes in the same location, and that might not be what you intended, but you can duplicate with Control-C, Control-V. I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and I'll show you another way to duplicate objects. I can select that rounded corner, and notice I'm in translation mode. You can hit W to get that gizmo, and I'm going to hold Alt on my keyboard and click and drag. If you hold Alt and click and drag, notice we've just duplicated it as we dragged it out. So press and hold Alt and translate the object. That's going to give you a duplicate. I'm going to go ahead and delete that one. And of course, you could rotate this by 90 degrees and you can translate it right into place. Now, you don't have to just translate objects to duplicate them. You can go into rotation mode and hold Alt and rotate the object. And that's going to also duplicate the object. So you'll be doing that a lot as well. So this corner here, let's say I'd like another corner right next to it. I can hold Alt, I can rotate, and now I have two. So these level prototyping tools are a good way to block out some basic geometry when we want to start prototyping our levels, and then we can play test and move around and see what it feels like to move past these different structures that we've placed in our level. So we've talked about the cube and the cylinder and the quarter cylinder. There's also the ramp, and I'd like you to get some practice with these, including that ramp, in your next challenge. So for this challenge, you're going to get a little bit of practice prototyping your level. Drag in some objects straight out from the content drawer, move them around, turn snapping on and off, rotate them, scale them, and just get a feel for manipulating the objects in your world. Maybe create a little bit of a level prototype. You know how to scale objects up, so if you want that floor platform to be a little bit larger, you know how to do that. You can also duplicate that platform, as you know how to copy and duplicate those objects, and get yourself a little bit of a prototype. Now, once you've prototyped some basic geometry, if you're so inclined, I'd like you to share your work with the community. Jump on over to the Druid Mechanics Discord and go to the Share Your Work channel. This is where people show off the work that they've been doing in the courses and also on their own, and show your level prototype here and see other people's level prototypes and comment on them. Be constructive, be nice, and this is a great way to collaborate with each other in the community and get some feedback. So go ahead and pause the video and get some practice level prototyping now. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of practice using the level prototyping tools and manipulating objects around, we're ready to continue, and I'll see you in the next video.